Min Hee told me that she questioned God all the time through her terrible experience. And this surprised her because questions were not allowed in North Korea because of a deadly combination of Confucianism and communism. In Confucianism, you never question authority, and certainly do not waste time asking unanswerable questions of a God that may or may not exist. Under communism, she was raised to virtually worship Kim Il-sung, who ran a quasi-religion, and questions were punishable by imprisonment or death. She was taught to sing at school, "Everything he does well." And when she was secretly taught Christianity by her mother, she thought the same of God. So up to the point she buried her child, her only prayer was, "Lord, everything you do well." And she would bow in prayer and obedience to his will, however hard it was to bear. But the moment she laid her dead son in the hard ground, something broke. And as she looked up into the dark sky, took a deep breath, and shouted with such force, "Oh God, I cannot believe in you anymore. This is too much to bear. What a waste of life. My husband is dead, my child is dead, and I am soon to die. What kind of a world is it when you do not raise a finger to help me?" And on she railed against God. And then, as she began to walk out of North Korea, hoping to be shot by the guards, on she shouted, "I'm finished with you." And then she stopped and said to herself, "Why do I keep shouting to God? After all, if I'm finished with him, why do I keep shouting to him?" In a flash, a thought ran through her. To be silent was to say there was no God to shout at. She realized that whatever her circumstances, she would always ask God questions to her dying day. She was still his creature. What else could she do? To be silent was to say there was no God to shout at. God wasn't fair, she thought, but he was there. That's why I kept shouting. And that, in a strange way, is faith too. And that's why in the book of Job, God speaks to the person with the questions, not to the people with the answers. So it's time that Job heard from God. It's not that talking is unhelpful, but it's incomplete. When we're going through a hard time, we need God to comfort. And when God does speak, it comes, says the book, like a whirlwind. There's energy, force, outrage even. And the final chapters of Job contain some of the most exhilarating and humbling language in the Bible. But at first glance, you wonder if God can really do pastoral counseling. He seems really angry and anxious to squelch Job. Let's hear a part of God's strange speech. "Job, have you ever walked on the ocean floor? Can you arrange the stars in groups like Orion and the Pleiades? Can you shout to the clouds and make rain? Job, who laid out a path for the lightning? Does the rain have a father who provides food for the ravens? Is it you who commands the eagle to rise? Job, can you catch sea monsters with a hook? Can you command the morning to appear? Do you have a thundering voice that compares with mine?" It's a fierce sounding speech. But how is it an answer to Job's complaint? In fact, at first glance, it almost seems as if God misses the point. "Job, do you have a powerful arm and a thundering voice that compares with mine?" Well, so what? Is might right? It almost seems as if God taunts Job. If you can't thread rings through the snouts of whales, well then be quiet. I only talk to beings as big as me. But remember, Job never said God wasn't powerful. His issue was, is God fair? And that question does not seem to be addressed. Why has God allowed a world so unfair? Why has he sat by and let Job suffer so much? out of all proportion to his sin? Is the creation not a terrible mistake because it is so full of trouble? That's the question, and that question doesn't seem to be addressed by this speech of God at all. And so we're left with this puzzle. How does God's speech answer Job's complaint? Well, it does, wonderfully, but we have to dig for it, like Job had to. The first word of God's speech is the one we want to focus on today, Job. Who does God make his speech to? Job. And who is Job? The person with the questions. Does God speak to the friends who had all the answers? Not a word, except to say in the final chapter, "You have not spoken about me correctly." God speaks to the person with the questions. God, it seems, and this comes as a surprise to some Christians, God can handle our questions. He can handle anything we throw at him. So wouldn't it be sad if we kept our questions to ourselves or pushed them down so deep that we never gave ourselves the opportunity of hearing from the one person in the universe that could really help and transform our questions into faith? The whole world is essentially about trust wars. God winning the wager with Satan. Remember back in chapters 1 and 2, Satan's running around and he says to God, "Job's just praising you because he's got all the toys, he's got all the blessings." And God says, "We'll see." So he allows Satan to take away the blessings. But Job never turns his back on God, even though he's lost all the blessings. He keeps trusting. That's why God wins. But how does he win it? A questioner wins the wager for faith. Job is a questioner par excellence, perhaps one of the great questioners of the Bible. What does he question? Well, first of all, he has questions about God, as we've seen. He questions whether God is loving. From his experience, he's inclined to think that God is vengeful. "Tell me what I've done wrong," he says in chapter 13. "Show me my rebellion and my sin. Why do you treat me as your enemy?" Would you terrify a leaf blown by the wind? Even a tree has more hope. If it is cut down, it will sprout again. But when people die, their strength is gone. They breathe their last. And then where are they? So he questions whether God is fair. From his vantage point, he's inclined to think that God is unjust. Why doesn't the Almighty bring the wicked to judgment? He asks in a later speech in chapter 24. Why must the godly wait for him in vain? He even questions whether God cares or is interested. He's inclined to think God is rather too elusive. "If only I knew where to find God," he cries in chapter 23. "I would go to his court." But he can't find his court. He longs for his former days when God took care of me, he says, when he lit up the way before me and I walked safely through the darkness. But now God has cut my bowstring. If only someone would listen to me. Let the Almighty answer me. But just the silence. God's playing hide and seek, too much for his comfort. But one word dispels the questions. Job. God is still interested. God still cares. God didn't have to speak. He doesn't have to explain himself to us. But he does. And that made all the difference to Job. Secondly, though, Job has questions about his friends. He doubted whether the defenders of God were right. About God, that is. And in this he was absolutely right. The friends were wrong to say there's no such thing as undeserved suffering. But there is. There's a lot going on in the world that we don't deserve, and we need a larger reply from a bigger God to come to terms with that. Job doubted their explanation, and that's why he ended up with a bigger God who cannot be confined to a simple formula. People with questions leave the last word to God. It's a tough journey, though. Questions require courage. The courage to come to God with all that we've got, all the brokenness, all the empty bits, all the ugly bits, all the nasty bits, the bits that don't make sense. We're asking God to help us make sense of it all. We've given up, and we admit it. It's up to Him. But we wouldn't be coming to Him if we didn't think it was worth it. People with all the answers tend not to go to God. What's the need? So they rarely hear from Him. And that's rather dull, because they can only really talk about God. What's very interesting in the book of Job is that the friends talk about God, but only Job talks to God. That's what questioners do. They need to go to God and hear from God. That's why they're more alive. That's why their Christian life is a lot more exciting, dangerous, exhilarating even. Minhee said, "Why do I keep shouting, 'I'm finished with you,'" she said. And she realized that whatever her circumstances, she would always ask God questions to her dying day. To be silent was to say there is no God to shout at, she said. "I'm finished with you," she shouted at the black sky. But really, what she was saying was, "I'm forever with you." And so persecuted Christians flip it all around. To shout out our questions is faith, because you're still inviting God to act. And some might say that's not faith at all. But persecuted Christians are more likely to see the voicing of our questions as one of the strongest acts of faith. They may be right. Perhaps the Christian life does need to be lived upside down.